timeless world of primal existence, the rules of survival are simple. Hunt or be hunted. Join with friends online to battle the world's most dangerous beasts and live to hunt another day. Monster Hunter. Buy it now for the Sony PlayStation 2. Rated T for teen. Only from Capcom.
What is a monster? Hunter. It seems like a pretty silly question with how massive the series has gotten. Even though for most of the series' lifespan, it was a pretty niche thing, only having the biggest releases come to the West. That's what makes it so hard if you're someone like me, wondering where it all started. How did this legendary series by Capcom even come to fruition? A pretty common known fun fact of the development of the first Monster Hunter game is the fact that it was made in tandem with a push for online games in the dawn of the PS2 Xbox era.
コンシューマー家庭用ゲーム機の、オンラインゲームをちょっと作っていきましょうみたいなね方向になってで3タイトル立ち上がってその時に同時に立ち上がったのはアウトモデルスタっていうレースゲームと、バイオハザードアウトブレイクっていう、バイオハザードを使ったネットワークゲームでもう一つがモンスターハンターということですね。
A great resource of information was an Iwata Ask for Monster Hunter Tri that was conducted with Monster Hunter 1's director Kaname Fujioka and series producer Ryozo Sugimoto, who stated that the series began series planning around 2002. What's interesting is that Ryozo Sugimoto was the planner for all 3 games in the big push for online by Capcom, stating that Monster Hunter was the culmination of all those online concepts into one package. Automodellista also wrapped up production and released in 2002, so that could be a sign of Ryozo seeing that Capcom was capable of delivering an online product. A lot of this is guesswork as there isn't too much information out there on the production. However, there is one funny bit of info that is specific to the so-called vibe of Monster Hunter. In that same Iwata Asks, Kaname brings up a manga whose English name is The First Human Gaiatrus. He really brought up the eating a big piece of meat part, which I think is pretty funny. This guy just wants you to lay back and eat a comically big ass chunk of meat, which has thankfully stayed in the game for over 2 decades, keeping his artistic vision intact. In reference of this specific manga is a greater point of this team really not wanting the game to be too brutal. In a game called Monster Hunter, you can really imagine if you wanted to, you can get really crazy with how visceral the details of hunting these monsters will get. But it seems the team behind it really wanted to keep a certain held back amount of violence, which I think is commendable. This Iwata Asks also has a lot of talk on how they wanted anyone of any skill to be able to interact with the game, which I think when a lot of people think of the old Monster Hunter games, they don't really seem to agree with. Iwata and Capcom seem to be really into the idea of being that one guy that does something other than fighting the big monster, like fishing or catching bugs, which after being brought up is pushed pretty hard by Iwata, which I think is pretty funny. Just the idea of Iwata being that one dickhead that does anything but the hunt. I don't want to rib the guy too much because he kind of perfectly put the ethos of the whole series, being one where you can advance in some way or do something even if it's such a hard game. It really is amazing how with such challenging fights later on as you go in the game, there's never a feeling of hitting a wall. There's always that advancement. You can always do something in your gear or skills as a player which gives it that addicting nature. I always tend to think of the series as a pretty no-fat MMO in other words. A lot of the gameplay loop is similar as to what you would find in other MMOs, being pretty gear specific. And while there isn't leveling, you unlock skills and perks with later better gear as the game goes on, still achieving that feeling of becoming the behemoth of a force while not taking away agency of the player in early game, but still retaining your moveset throughout the entire game. Gear actually seemed to come as an accident to the developers, saying that the idea of there being specific part wards came from an illustration done early on, with a hunter defeating a Laoshan lung and trying to pry apart from the dead monster's corpse. I think it's very cool, a very integral part of Monster Hunter's identity and gameplay loop came from a random concept one of the artists had. The developers were on the right track when it came to thinking that coming back from a hunt with nothing would be less fun than having some reward you got from a specific monster. I think the developers wouldn't doubt the MMO comparison to the older games, because it's a series that heavily relied on expansions. Monster Hunter G, the Japanese exclusive expansion, came out not even a year after the first game, having an early 2005 release date. I'm not really tapped in the heart of Japanese culture, as this could be pretty standard practice over there for single-player games, and Capcom specifically did this a ton with their fighting games. But for single-player/multiplayer games, it was a pretty cool and fresh concept when I first heard it, and I may be falling for the trap of thinking that Monster Hunter is a single-player game with online components, but I think that's how most people interacted with it at first. Something also to mention was that World of Warcraft hadn't even released as the first Monster Hunter game came out, being closer to Monster Hunter G in release if anything. I always tend to compare the two, as they have pretty similar concepts of gear being a pretty big part of the character improvement experience, multiplayer quests being a big slice of content. In-game for WoW is pretty different compared to Monster Hunter, but that's just because how grand it gets with raids. I think the endgame elders of Monster Hunter are pretty comparable to WoW raids, and the heightened stress and skill needed to complete the quests, compared to the other content in the game. There's actually a GameStop piece by Mike Mahardy I'm comparing Monster Hunter World to Destiny, which is a modern analog to what I'm trying to present, but still rings true. Especially as World, of any of the games, had a more live service focus on delivering content pretty regularly. This video is pretty short, so if you want to see the arguments, it's linked in the description. You may be asking yourself, why hasn't this video actually touched on the origins and concepts of Monster Hunter 1 yet? And to that I say, Monster Hunter Illustrations 1 is one of the coolest art books I've ever had the pleasure of looking through. It goes through the first 2 games of the series, and has commentary from both Konami and a designer, Tomonori Kanbei, on many of the concepts and ideas of the game. I even used some of the anecdotes from this book earlier because it's too valuable of a resource when it comes to the history of the game. Some pretty recent developments that gave a great background to this book is a 20th anniversary dev video done on the Monster Hunter YouTube channel. Both Konami and Ryozo sit down and reveal that Monster Hunter was a pretty fantasy-oriented game in the early stages, having regular dragons and goblins while still retaining the hunter style of gameplay, or what the book calls bounty hunting style of gameplay. I'd like to think that this concept was later used on another Capcom game, Dragon's Dogma, which also has been compared to Monster Hunter in its gameplay. Back to the book, it opens up with some illustrations that seem to be from a time period where they decided to stray away from tropes and try to create something unique. But you can still tell this is pretty early with concepts seemingly lost to time. This artwork of the monster later said to be the Guy Dragon just looks so crazy to me. They were playing on some of these monsters to be gigantic beasts compared to how they tower in game. And while some of the monsters are extremely large in the game, a lot of these concepts seem to love the idea of these gigantic monsters. I think that they realized the PlayStation 2 hardware really couldn't accommodate a gigantic monster plus 4 hunters all at the same time. Here's this freaky looking drawing of a blue design for the Tigrex that really creeps me the fuck out. I have no idea what it is about this, about a monster that's been portrayed as such a meathead for most of the games, but it's kinda cool seeing such a weirdly sinister look for him. Later on in the book we get a good look at the goblin designs that were prototypes of what the felines would become. Even though it's stated directly that the Shakalakas would be an iteration on these early concepts, I still think that some of the designs are really killer, and I wish I got a little goblin buddy in a game like this. There's been a couple of discussions on this book, and I've never seen people get praised how rad this crab dude is. I don't know what it is about him. He'd probably just be really annoying to fight with those long blades, but I still wish he could have appeared in game. Can you imagine the armor sets those blades would make? There's been a lot shared about the Jaw Wyvern. I obviously think he's pretty cool, but I think something that team ran into later on is they keep creating monsters that were just wyverns. Like they would literally all have the same body type, but just have a special trait about them. I think I bring this up specifically for the Jaw Wyvern because I can assume he just became the Kezu, with the skin and lack of eyesight and sense of smell heightened. Even though there is a dragon way later on in the series, there's a very realized version of this original concept of a dilapidated dragon. I still think it's cool seeing how a design like this is spun into the final game. Another example of why I think they went with using the Wyvern body type as a stepping stone for design explorations is this fish-eating Wyvern, which is obviously just a prototype Velocidrome, and all of the drones for that matter. It's cool seeing a beefed up drone, but I'm honestly glad we weren't just fighting a billion different Wyverns the whole game. I kinda wanna skip over the Equal Dragon weapon, and some of the other very heavily talked about things in this book. Not just because I would hate to bring it up again when I don't really have much to add on the matter. It's a pretty sick concept, what do you want me to say? But also there's a million other people out there that can probably give this concept its flowers, that it deserves way better than I can. This Rathalos armor sketch seems to have a regular sword next to him. I know it's probably just a design for the red saber, and I'm pretty sure later when they specifically go into weapons, they show it's just the red saber. But there's just a lot of unused weapon types. I'll go into it more as we see them, but there's still some really cool stuff in here I wish could have made it in, and here's one of them. This design was heavily used in early sketches and concepts. This double-sided blade, almost as big as what a greatsword would become in some pieces. I think it's safe to say this would later become the Insect Glaive, but instead of being a pretty visceral weapon, the glaive focused more on the verticality of Monster Hunter 4. Something to note is that in some of these designs, each side of the blade is seemingly pretty different. I don't know if they were going for more of a cutting side and more of a brunt focused side, like having the benefits of a sword and a hammer all in one weapon. We can only speculate though. Here's a Shrimp Man in his iconic raw and boiled forms, and here's a Cocoon Man in his the townsfolk seem to stay pretty consistent between concept and execution in game. I always thought Monster Hunter had some pretty cool separation when it came to its villagers, always wondering if they were human or not, never to the point where it was too far off that it was an easy tell, but just enough to keep you thinking. Thought it was always fun. Also, before I end off, I want to spotlight some cut content and just general things I couldn't quite fit in nicely. There isn't much cut content when it comes to Monster Hunter 1, at least from what we know of, but there are some cut menu assets showing a controller layout for an OG Xbox controller. We don't really know how serious an OG Xbox port was, as Capcom really wasn't known to ship games on there too often, even though there are some few exceptions. It was just pretty shocking seeing this, as Monster Hunter always had seemed like a weirdly anti-Xbox series for a while. Frontier did get a 360 port along with PS3, to my knowledge. But besides that, until World came out, there really wasn't anything, especially nothing in the US. Also, speaking of UI, here's this sci-fi looking UI element that was left in the files. I'd have to assume it was placeholder, but it is funny seeing this in comparison to the other UI elements.
Wii で出るモンハン G やで。
やってみいな。
いくでい。あかんわも
ちょかしてみ。こうやろ。こうやって。ほらね。
う。めっちゃうまいがな。
ほんでやな。Wii をネットにつなげば離れた友達とおうちで狩りが楽しめるのや。それドカーンとドゥ
もう帰って。
Wii で始めよう G 級な暮らし。モンスターハンター G。